The Interstellar Diplomatic Assembly had protocols for everything, 17,000 pages of them to be precise, covering every conceivable scenario from atmospheric incompatibility to the proper angle at which to present one's reproductive organs in greeting. Subsection 47C dealt specifically with humanity, and it could be summarized in 3 words that appeared in bold, underlined and highlighted in what the Yenthari called the color of impending doom: do not provoke. Naturally, nobody actually read subsection. The current situation, therefore, represented what historians would later describe as a perfectly predictable catastrophe that everyone was too arrogant to see coming. The Empress of the Terran Dominion sat in her throne, which was less a chair and more a statement about the fragility of organic matter. It had been carved from a single piece of asteroid iron, and incorporated the skeletal remains of something that had once attempted to conquer Earth. The species in question no longer existed, which really should have told everyone something important. The Empress herself looked remarkably human, which was the first of many mistakes made by those unfamiliar with humanity. She appeared to be perhaps 30 cycles old, with features that suggested distant ancestors from Earth's eastern continents, dark hair pulled into a style that managed to be both elegant and vaguely threatening, and eyes that held the kind of warmth typically associated with the heart of a dying star. She wore formal diplomatic attire which for humans meant something that covered the relevant biology, while making absolutely certain everyone understood that clothes were a choice, not a necessity, and that choice could be revoked. Ambassador Hentavius of the Progenitor Fleet had been speaking for approximately 43 minutes. This was remarkable because his species, the Althame, typically concluded all negotiations in under 5 minutes. They were what other species politely called efficiency-oriented, and what humans called insufferable windbags, who think evolution peaked with their particular arrangement of sensory organs. The Althame had invented faster-than-light travel roughly 30,000 years before humanity discovered fire. They reminded everyone of this fact constantly, the way a particularly insecure child might mention their wealthy parents at every opportunity. Their ships were sleek, their technology was incomprehensible to lesser species, and their sense of superiority was so dense it created its own gravitational field. Hentavius stood on his lower 4 appendages, while gesturing with his upper 6, creating a display that looked like a very angry chandelier having an argument with itself. His translator rendered his speech in what it calculated to be maximally condescending tones, which meant every third word was obviously, clearly, or as any civilized species would understand. The Empress had not moved in 42 minutes. This was noted by the various observers present, including representatives from the Gelthian consciousness, the Frail Cooperative, and the Euthani High. They recognized this stillness for what it was, the same type of motionlessness exhibited by Earth predators in the microseconds before they turned prey into past tense. Human advisors stood along the walls of the throne room, and if one were particularly observant, one might notice that several had quietly removed themselves to positions behind blast shielding. The Empress's personal guard, all human, had adopted a stance that military tacticians called relaxed readiness, and that anyone with functional survival instincts called oh no. Hentavius reached what he clearly believed was his rhetorical crescendo. He extended all 10 appendages in a gesture that in his culture signified absolute dominance, and in human culture, looked like a spider trying to surrender to a fly swatter. And so, he declared, his voice carrying across the chamber with the resonance of someone who had never been told to shut up. The Althane consensus has determined that humanity's continued expansion into the outer reaches violates approximately 17,000 protocols of civilized conduct. Your species lacks the evolutionary sophistication, the cultural refinement, and frankly, the basic neural architecture necessary for independent governance of colonized systems. The Empress blinked, once, slowly. Hentavius interpreted this as confusion rather than the loading of a biological weapons system. We recognize that your species is, relatively speaking, still in its infancy. You have only been spacefaring for 3 centuries. Many species require supervision during their developmental period. There is no shame in admitting that humanity requires guidance from those who have walked the stars for millennia. One of the human advisors made a sound that the translator rendered as coughing, but which was actually closer to the noise one makes when witnessing a traffic accident in slow motion. We propose, Hentavius continued, warming to his subject with the enthusiasm of someone digging their own grave while mistaking it for a swimming pool, a wardship agreement. The Altheme would assume responsibility for human colonies, ensuring they are administered according to proper standards. Humanity would retain nominal independence, of course, but all major decisions would be subject to Altheme approval. This is for your own benefit, naturally. We would be doing you a favor. The temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees. This was not metaphoric. The Empress's internal body temperature had shifted enough to affect the surrounding atmosphere, a biological quirk resulting from humanity's genetic modifications during the War of Unification. When humans got angry, physics itself started taking note. Ambassador Hentavius, the Empress said, and her voice was the auditory equivalent of silk sliding over a blade. Let me ensure I understand your position. You believe humanity requires supervision. Precisely, Hentavius said, apparently mistaking the question for genuine interest. I am pleased we can approach this matter rationally. Many younger species become emotional when confronted with their limitations, and you believe your species is qualified to provide this supervision. We have guided 17 species through their developmental periods. All have benefited enormously from our wisdom.
I see.
The Empress stood up. She moved with the kind of grace that made biomechanics professors weep with envy, and survival instincts scream with terror. She descended the 3 steps from her throne with the measured pace of someone who had already calculated 17 ways to end a life and was selecting the most educational option. And tell me, Ambassador, in your wisdom, did your research include any analysis of human history? Hentavius waved an appendage dismissively. We reviewed the relevant data, primitive conflicts, tribal disputes, nothing that would concern a species of our standing. Nothing that would concern you, the Empress repeated. She had closed half the distance between them. The observing ambassadors had begun quietly edging toward the exits. Ambassador, do you know what humans call the 20th century? I cannot say I devoted significant attention to such details. We call it Tuesday. The Empress smiled. It was not a comforting expression. In a single century, with technology barely sufficient to leave our own atmosphere, humanity killed approximately 150 million of our own species through warfare alone. We invented weapons capable of rendering our entire planet uninhabitable, and came within minutes of using them on multiple occasions. We did this while we could barely reach our own moon. Hentavius shifted slightly, his appendages pulling inward in a gesture that his species used to indicate mild discomfort. Yes, well, such savagery is precisely why supervision is necessary. That savagery, the Empress said, is why you should have stayed in your section of space. She had reached conversational distance now, close enough that Hentavius could see himself reflected in her eyes, and perhaps understand what prey felt like. But you came here to my throne room, representing your ancient and wise civilization, and suggested that humanity submit to your authority. You implied that we are children playing at civilization. You indicated that our sovereignty is something you might permit us to keep as a courtesy. I merely stated facts, Hentavius said. But his translator was starting to add uncertainty markers to his words, little auditory flags that suggested he was beginning to suspect he had made a miscalculation. Ambassador Hentavius, the Empress said, and now her voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrible. My advisors suggested I exercise patience. They reminded me that the Altheme are a powerful species with significant influence. They noted that violence would complicate our diplomatic position. She paused. So I am being patient. What happened next took approximately 1.3 seconds. The Empress moved with the speed that had made humanity the apex predator of Earth, long before they reached space. Her hand shot out, grasped Hentavius's leading appendage, and tore it from his body with a wet, organic sound that translators across the galaxy struggled to render in polite terms. Hentavius's scream achieved frequencies that several species literally could not hear, while the Empress held the severed appendage with the casual regard one might afford a particularly disappointing piece of fruit. There, she said, dropping the appendage on the floor where it twitched with residual neural activity. I only removed your arm, not your head. This is me being patient. This is me exercising restraint. This is me responding to provocation with mercy. Hentavius collapsed, his remaining appendages clutching at the wound while his bodyguards rushed forward with medical equipment. The observing ambassadors had frozen in various states of horror, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The Empress returned to her throne, sat down and examined her hand with mild distaste before accepting a cloth from an advisor. I believe this diplomatic session is concluded. Please convey to the Altheian consensus that humanity declines their generous offer of war. We will continue managing our own affairs. If they would like to discuss alternative arrangements, they are welcome to send another ambassador. She smiled again. Though I suggest they read subsection 47C first. The throne room emptied in record time. Medical personnel evacuated Hentivius, who was still making sounds that suggested he was re-evaluating many of his life choices. The human advisors began the tedious process of documenting the incident for the official record. Their reports filled with phrases like proportional response to diplomatic insult and remarkable restraint under provocation. In 17 languages across 500 star systems, emergency diplomatic channels activated. The message was simple, urgent, and identical in tone despite translation. The humans had done it again. Someone needed to explain to the rest of the galaxy that when humans said they were being patient, this was not a mistranslation. This was a threat, and perhaps most terrifyingly, from humanity's perspective, it was the truth. The emergency conclave convened 6 hours after what was now being called the incident, in official channels. In that time, the human pulled off the pompous idiot's arm in unofficial one. The meeting took place aboard the neutral station Pinnacle 7, a massive construct floating in unclaimed space that served as the galaxy's unofficial therapy session location for when species needed to discuss why they were afraid of each other. 12 species sent representatives. The Altheian sent their entire high command, along with approximately 7 metric tons of medical documentation describing Hentivius's injuries in excruciating detail. The general consensus among non-Altheian observers was that the injuries were in fact quite educational, and that perhaps Hentivius should have considered alternative career paths, such as anything that did not involve talking. Ambassador Winforth of the Gelthian consciousness took the floor first, their translucent form rippling with what passed for exasperation. Among a species composed primarily of organized gas. We need to address the fundamental problem, they said, their voice synthesized through speakers that made them sound perpetually disappointed. Humanity continues to view violence as a valid diplomatic tool. That is not accurate, interjected Elder Braun of the Frial Cooperative, whose species had been studying humanity for the better part of a century with the dedication of scientists observing a particularly volatile chemical reaction. Humanity views violence as the diplomatic tool. Everything else is just the negotiation about when and how much violence will be applied. The Altheian delegation made a collective noise of outrage, which sounded like wind chimes having an anxiety attack. This savagery cannot be tolerated, declared High Commander Vithis, who had the unenviable position of explaining to his government why their ambassador came home with 20% less body than he had left with. The human leader committed an act of barbarism in full view of diplomatic witnesses. This demands consequences. Does it, though? Asked Elder Braun, who had developed the particular brand of fatalism that came from actually understanding human. I have reviewed your ambassador's speech transcript. He insulted their sovereignty, implied they were evolutionary inferiors, and suggested forcible supervision of their colonies. In human terms, this is called asking for it. The assembled species erupted in what translators struggled to render as anything other than multilingual confusion with aggressive undertone. What none of them understood, because none of them had bothered to actually study Earth history beyond the sanitized summaries, was that humanity had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of creative violence. While other species developed faster than light travel and energy manipulation, humans had been developing approximately 700 different martial arts, 16,000 variations of edged weapons, and an entire philosophical framework around the question, how do we kill that thing more efficiently? The Yenthari representative, a being resembling a collection of crystals arranged in a vaguely threatening pattern, pulsed with colors indicating deep concern. We must examine the historical precedent. 3 years ago, the Dravian hegemony attempted to claim a human mining colony, citing prior territorial rights. The human response was to visit the Dravian homeworld and challenge their entire military command structure to single combat. Simultaneous, they won, added Elder Braun, unnecessarily. 17 champions. The Yenthari continued. 17 of the finest warriors the Dravian species had produced over 2 millennia of selective breeding and combat training. The human sent to face them was a colonial administrator, whose primary job involved filing mineral extraction reports. She defeated all 17 in under an hour, and then filed the proper documentation to claim salvage rights on their ceremonial armor. High Commander Vithis bristled, his appendages flaring in indignation. These examples prove my point. Humanity operates outside civilized norms. They must be constrained. Constrained by whom? Ambassador Onefirst's form darkened to a shade that indicated they already knew the answer would be unpleasant. The Federation tried imposing trade restrictions 4 years ago. Humanity responded by developing alternative supply chains in 6 months and then offering better trade terms to the Federation's own member worlds. Half of them defected. The Federation still has not recovered. The emergency meeting devolved into what historians would generously call vigorous debate, and what everyone else called 12 species arguing about whether humans were terrifying or just really good at being terrifying. The Euthani Hive representative, speaking through their collective consciousness with the unified voice of 3 billion individuals, attempted to bring order to the proceeding. The question is not whether humanity is dangerous, they stated, their tone carrying the weight of billions of minds reaching the same uncomfortable conclusion. We established that during the First Contact War, when a single human vessel destroyed 17 of our colony ships before we realized they considered it self-defense. The question is whether this particular incident represents an escalation, or, as the human claimed, This brought the arguing to a halt. The assembled delegates pondered the uncomfortable reality that they were genuinely debating whether removing someone's appendage counted as mercy. Elder Braun pulled up holographic displays, his aged features set in an expression that suggested he had given this exact presentation too many times. Let me provide context. The human concept of restraint must be understood through their evolutionary history. Their planet was a death world by our standards. Gravity 0.8 times standard, oxygen levels that would be toxic to most species, and an ecosystem where literally everything evolved to kill everything else. Humans are persistence hunters. They do not have natural weapons, so they developed psychological ones. The displays showed Earth predators, creatures that made several delegates recoil in horror. Then they showed humans, who looked comparatively harmless until Elder Braun showed them hunting megafauna by following them until the animals literally died of exhaustion. They did not evolve to be strong or fast, Braun continued. They evolved to be relentless and creative. When the Empress removed Ambassador Hintevius's appendage, she made a choice. Her options included the 17 other appendages, his respiratory system, his sensory organs, or any combination thereof. She selected the least lethal option that would still communicate her position clearly. Her position being that she could have killed him but chose not to. Onefirst said slowly, their form flickering with what might have been understanding or might have been existential dread. It was hard to tell with Gelthians. Precisely, and now we must decide how to respond. Braun closed the displays. The Ulthium want consequences for human aggression, but applying consequences requires leverage, and humanity has spent 3 centuries ensuring that no one has leverage over them. They are economically independent, militarily formidable, and diplomatically isolated by choice, not necessity. They do not need us. We need them to continue pretending that galactic civilization matters. High Commander Vethis stood abruptly, his remaining appendages trembling with what his species experienced as humiliation. You suggest we do nothing, that we accept this barbarism as norm. I suggest, Elder Braun said, with the tired patience of someone explaining gravity to a species that had forgotten how to fall, that we recognize what actually happened. The Empress was asked to be patient. She was patient. She communicated her boundaries using the minimum necessary force. That this seems horrifying to us says more about our assumptions than her actions. The chamber fell silent as this sank in. Somewhere in the collective consciousness of galactic civilization, a realization was forming. They had not been negotiating with humans on equal terms because they had fundamentally misunderstood what humans considered negotiation. For humanity, removing an arm instead of a head was not violent. It was diplomacy. It was them trying to play nice. And if this was humanity being patient,
Several delegates thought with growing horror, what did human impatience look like? They were about to find out.
The Empress received the conclave's delegation in a different venue this time, not her throne room, which was currently being cleaned by personnel who had drawn the short straw and were discovering that Althane biology left distinctive stains, but rather in what humans called a conference room, and what everyone else called a deeply uncomfortable box designed to remind you that walls are a suggestion. The room was aggressively plain, white surfaces, minimal decoration, furniture designed for function rather than comfort. The Empress sat at the head of a table that could have been pulled from any corporate office on any human world. She wore civilian attire, which somehow made her more threatening than the formal regalia hat. It suggested that dismemberment was just part of her regular Tuesday schedule, not even worth dressing up for. Elder Braun led the delegation, having been volunteered by virtue of being the only one who had previously survived negotiations with humans. He was accompanied by Ambassador Weinfurth, two Eutheny Hive representatives who shared one consciousness and therefore one vote, but had insisted on bringing two bodies for moral support, and a Frau military observer, whose job was to calculate exactly how badly this could go. Conspicuously absent was anyone from the Althane delegation. They had sent a formal written apology, which the Empress had acknowledged by having it framed and mounted in the station's main corridor, as what humans called a teaching moment. "Thank you for seeing us," Elder Braun began, settling into a chair designed for beings with spines. "We appreciate your willingness to continue diplomatic discourse." "I am always willing to talk," the Empress replied. Her tone was pleasant, which made every non-human in the room calculate escape routes. "Violence should be a last resort, not a first option. This is why I only removed Ambassador Hentavius's arm instead of, say, everything above his shoulder." The Frau observer made a note. Human continues to believe partial dismemberment represents diplomatic restraint. Recommend updating threat assessment matrices. Weinfurth's gaseous form shifted colors through what their species considered calming patterns, which humans found vaguely nauseating. "We have reviewed the incident. There is a consensus that perhaps Ambassador Hentavius's approach lacked certain diplomatic sensitivities. He called my species developmentally challenged children who needed supervision," the Empress said. "These are what humans call fighting words. In previous centuries this would have resulted in warfare. I gave him a warning, an educational one." "Educational," repeated one of the Eutheny representatives, speaking for 3 billion minds who were all simultaneously trying to process this concept. "You view physical mutilation as education. I view it as clear communication. Ambassador Hentavius now understands boundaries he previously did not recognize. This is the definition of education, that he learned through experience rather than lecture, is a pedagogical choice." Elder Braun decided to change tactics, having learned that arguing semantics with humans was like arguing physics with a black hole, technically possible, but ultimately pointless. The conclave would like to propose a framework for future diplomatic interaction, one that might prevent similar educational opportunities. "I am listening." The Empress leaned back in her chair, the picture of someone who was genuinely interested in alternatives to violence, but remained unconvinced that such alternatives exist. "First," Braun said, pulling up holographic documents that he had spent 6 hours preparing, and would likely be inadequate, "we propose mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all ambassadors assigned to human territory. This would include comprehensive studies of human history, psychology, and what you call unspoken rules that everyone should obviously know." "Acceptable. Continue." "Second, we suggest establishing a diplomatic buffer protocol. Any species wishing to make formal proposals regarding human sovereignty must first submit their intentions to a review board consisting of species who have successfully negotiated with humanity without losing body parts." The Empress considered that. "So basically Elder Braun and whoever else has figured out that we mean what we say." "Essentially yes. Also acceptable. Though I note this would have excluded approximately 90% of current diplomatic corps from speaking to us, which seems like it might be your problem, not mine." Weinfurth flowed forward slightly, their form condensing in what passed for earnestness among sentient gas clouds. "There is a third point, one that we debated extensively before including." They paused, which was impressive for a being without lungs. "The conclave requests that humanity provide clear documentation of what constitutes provocation and what constitutes appropriate response." The room temperature dropped several degrees. The Empress's expression did not change, but her stillness became the kind of stillness that prey animals recognized on an instinctual level. You want us to explain how not to make us angry. Her voice was soft. You want a manual, a guidebook, how to interact with humans without getting hurt. A comprehensive guide for species who cannot be bothered to treat us like equals. That is not how we would phrase it, Wentworth said quickly. But it is what you mean. The Empress stood up. She did not move toward them, but everyone in the room felt like she had. Let me clarify something about human psychology that apparently every species in this galaxy struggles to comprehend. We do not have different rules. We have the same rules everyone else has. Treat others with respect. Recognize sovereignty. Do not attempt to subjugate species who have politely asked you not to. She walked to the window, looking out at the stars visible beyond the station's hull. The Altham have subjugated 17 species. They mention this themselves. They take pride in it. They view themselves as benevolent overseers, guiding lesser civilizations toward enlightenment. And when they applied this same approach to humanity, I responded with violence. Not because humans are savage. Not because we lack diplomatic sophistication, but because we refuse to be subjugated, and we will use whatever force is necessary to communicate this refusal. Elder Braun nodded slowly. Then the question becomes, how do we distinguish between proposals you will find merely insulting, versus those you will find arm removal level insulting? That is the question you should have been asking 3 centuries ago, when we achieved faster than light travel, and you decided to test whether we were serious about our independence. The Empress turned back to face them. Here is your manual, Elder Braun. Ready? Write this. Do not treat humans like children. Do not treat humans like subjects. Do not assume that because we are younger than you, we are lesser than you. Do not mistake our willingness to negotiate for weakness, and absolutely, under no circumstances, tell us that we need supervision. That is all, one of the Euthani asked. That is all. Everything else is just variations on the theme of, treat us like equals, or learn why Earth predators evolved the way they did. She returned to her seat. Is this really so complicated? The Frel managed it. The Yenthari managed it. Even the Euthani, who are literally a hive mind operating on a completely different consciousness framework, managed to figure out how to speak to us without implying we are inferior. The Frel observer was writing rapidly. His notes included gems like human concept of equality is non-negotiable, and reminder, humans mean exactly what they say. This is not metaphor or hyperbole, and request hazard pay increase. Wentworth's form had shifted to colors indicating careful consideration. What you are describing is a fundamental restructuring of how the conclave approaches humanity. Many species base their diplomatic hierarchy on age and technological development. Humanity is young and by certain metrics, less advanced than elder species. And yet, the Empress said, we are expanding. Our colonies thrive, our economy grows, our military has never lost a conflict with external species. We achieve these things without guidance, without supervision, without the wisdom of elder species who apparently spent their millennia learning everything except how to recognize equals when they see them. Elder Braun closed the holographic documents. They were irrelevant. The real negotiation was happening in the subtext, in the space between words where humans lived and where other species struggled to follow. You are asking for recognition, true recognition, not as proteges or junior members or developing species, but as people. I am not asking, the Empress corrected. I am explaining what already exists. Humanity is not seeking permission to be equals. We are equals. We are simply waiting for the rest of you to update your assessments to match reality. She smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it, though it was the kind of warmth given off by a recently fired weapon. Consider Ambassador Hentavius's education, a complimentary seminar on this topic. Future lessons will be significantly more expensive. The delegation sat in silence, processing the reality that they had not come here to negotiate terms with humanity. They had come here to be told what the terms were. The shift in power dynamics was so complete that several of them were still trying to figure out when exactly it had happened. Elder Braun suspected it had happened about 3 centuries ago, when humanity first left Earth, Everyone else had just been too busy congratulating themselves on being ancient and wise to note. The treaty took 48 hours to draft, which was either remarkably fast or painfully slow depending on whether you measured time in diplomatic cycles or human patience. The final document became known as the Accord of Mutual Recognition, though humans privately called it the Please Stop Making Us Hurt You Agreement, and several elder species called it the Day We Admitted We Were Wrong, which we will never speak of again. Its core provisions were simple enough that even species who had been conducting diplomacy for 30,000 years could understand them. Humanity was recognized as a fully sovereign peer civilization. All previous proposals for supervision or guidance were formally withdrawn and apologized for, and a new diplomatic protocol was established requiring cultural education before any ambassador could be assigned to human territories. The Althheim, predictably, took the longest to sign. Their government spent 3 days debating the implications before one of their junior diplomats pointed out that they could either sign a piece of paper or wait for humanity to visit their homeworld and explain the concept of equality through interpretive violence. Hentavius, recovering in a medical facility with a newly cloned appendage, was reported to have personally endorsed this decision. What nobody discussed in official channels, but everyone understood in the spaces between words, was that the treaty changed nothing about humanity's actual position. They had always been peers, they had always been sovereign. The treaty simply made everyone else admit it in writing, which humans seemed to find psychologically important. Elder Braun theorized this was related to their species' obsession with documentation, which itself stemmed from spending millennia in tribal conflicts, where he said, she said, could escalate into generational warfare. The implementation phase proved educational in its own right. The mandatory cultural training program, administered by human academics, who had been recruited with promises of "you get to tell ancient aliens why they are wrong about everything," became unexpectedly popular. Enrollment exceeded projections by 300% after word spread that the course included detailed explanations of human emotional ranges, complete with case studies like why implying someone needs supervision will result in violence, and recognizing the difference between a human who is annoyed and a human who is about to end your biological function. Ambassador Wunfirth attended the first seminar, and later reported to the conclave that they had learned more about human psychology in 6 hours than in 6 years of diplomatic observation. The key insight, they explained, was that humans experienced most interactions through emotional frameworks, rather than logical ones, and that what appeared to be irrational violence was actually extremely rational once you understood the emotion driving it. The Empress, for her part, appeared satisfied with the arrangement. She gave a formal address to the conclave 6 months after the incident, delivered via holo conference from her throne room, which had been redecorated with what she described as motivational reminders, and what everyone else recognized as weapons from various failed attempts to conquer humanity throughout history. "I want to thank the conclave for their willingness to learn," she said, her tone warm enough to be diplomatic and cold enough to remind everyone what happened when learning was refused. "This represents progress, real progress, not because you have changed your fundamental nature, but because you have acknowledged ours." She paused, looking directly at the camera with the kind of eye contact that made everyone watching feel personally observed. "Humanity does not seek conflict. We never have. We seek recognition. The simple acknowledgement that we have as much right to exist and expand and thrive as any species who came before us. That several species needed educational interventions to understand this says more about galactic civilization than it does about humanity." The address concluded with what became the most quoted line in diplomatic history: "We will always prefer words to violence, but we will always prefer violence to subjugation. Remember this, and we will get along fine." Elder Braun, watching the address alongside several other delegates, allowed himself a small smile. The other species were still learning, still adapting, still trying to reconcile their ancient assumptions with the reality of humanity. But they were learning, which was more than could be said for Ambassador Hentavius when he walked into that throne room. The frail military observer, who had been promoted based on his accurate threat assessments, filed his final report on the incident. It concluded with an observation that he considered rather profound. "Humanity's greatest weapon is not their capacity for violence,
but their ability to make other species grateful that violence was not worse. The Empress removed an arm and the galaxy thanked her for her restraint. This is mastery of psychological warfare at a level we barely comprehend. In the end, the incident became required study in every diplomatic academy in known space. Future ambassadors analyzed it from every angle, discussed its implications, and learned the fundamental lesson that humanity had been trying to teach for 3 centuries. They were not asking for a place at the table, they had built their own table. They were simply being polite enough to let others sit at it, provided those others remembered basic manners, and if they forgot, well, humanity had demonstrated their educational methods, quite clearly. The Empress never publicly discussed the incident again, though her advisors noted that she seemed more relaxed afterward, as if some long-standing tension had finally resolved. When asked privately if she regretted the violence, she reportedly laughed and said, "I regret that it was necessary, but I do not regret that it was effective." Ambassador Hentavius eventually returned to diplomatic service, though never again in dealings with humanity. He did, however, become a vocal advocate for the cultural training programs, often speaking to new diplomats about the importance of understanding species differences. His lectures were renowned for their vivid detail and unusual passion. He always spoke with his hands. Well,